Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Meridian Australis Roundtable. Today is a very, very special episode as we are joined by Australian cyberpunk author Tim Napper. Tim is an acclaimed speculative fiction author known for his deeply immersive and thought provoking science fiction. With a background that includes extensive work in humanitarian aid across Southeast Asia, his writing is infused with a rich understanding of human complexity and global perspectives. His debut novel, 36 Streets, was celebrated for its cyberpunk grit and emotional depth. We're so lucky to be able to welcome Tim to the show today to talk about not only 36 Streets, but his most recently published novel, The Escher Man, as well as just cyberpunk and the Australian publishing landscape in general. Tim, how you going?
Great. Well, thank you for the effusive introduction. I'm sure you're going to have it on your the title page for this interview, but it's is TR Napa on my books. Um, but I'm sure your audience can figure that out. But Tim, from now on, that's fine.
Well, firstly, I think I wanted to handball straight to Arden because I very recently read 36 Streets, but I'm a bit of a cyberpunk newbie, as it were. I've seen both the Blade Runner movies and that's about it. Whereas I think Arden's much more well versed in the landscape. So I thought he could kick us off with a few questions about 36 Streets.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you've hit the nail on the head in that for me, cyberpunk has been something that I've loved for a long time. I've definitely immersed myself in it. And so when I found 36 Streets, I was blown away that there was an Australian cyberpunk novel. I thought that was a really exciting and it was definitely something that I'd not expected. I think I'd read an awful lot of American cyberpunk, and to see Australianisms in cyberpunk was refreshing. And yeah, I had me hooked. Um, Something I'd like to actually ask on that though, Tim, would be like, you, how did you get into cyberpunk in the first place, and how did that kind of lead you to start writing 36 Streets?
Yeah, you're right. There's not much Australian cyberpunk. It's a rare bird indeed. There's you could say Greg Egan and Grace Chan. I think who you know. I think you've interviewed Grace and a couple of others. But really, it's quite uncommon here for us to be Australians to be writing it. Um, how would I get into cyberpunk? But I think that it's one of these questions that, in a way, in terms of creative, you just mean as a genre that I love, or as creatively as a writer?
A bit of both. I mean, like, what was your introduction to the genre as a reader or a viewer, and then how did that kind of click as a thing that you wanted to pursue creatively yourself?
Well, Blade Runner is my favorite movie. Um, Now, if you asked me my favorite novel, I'd have a long meandering answer that would name 15 different things. And then even at the end, I'd say, but I'm still not sure. But if you ask me what my favorite film is, I'm quite sure it's Blade Runner. Probably my second or third favorite film. Certainly the top five would be, I'm wearing the shirt actually. Ghost in the Shell would be my one of my others. Um, and so what I and those and I probably didn't even know at the time why I love them so much, but I was drawn to those two films in particular. And then and then afterwards I'm like, oh, these are cyberpunk. And then also, what is this? What is this thing I'm fascinated by? And it's got just a lot of the things that are of personal concern, personal passion or interest for me creatively, which is, it's cyberpunk worlds are high tech, low life. They have staggering inequality. They're dystopic. They're taking certain elements of our present and projecting them into the future as a warning. Um, they are, in the case of, say, Ghost in the Shell, it's propulsive and, well, they're both immersive. Um, and so they have that capacity to immerse you in this totally different world and propel you through this strangely familiar future universe that has all these cool technologies and cool ideas. But after it's all done, what I love about those two films and what I love about good cyberpunk is makes you think. and it has deeper philosophical ideas about what is the human soul and what does it mean to be human. Kind of these fundamental, unanswerable questions that yet it kind of touches on or reaches towards. So it's I think the fact that it's a deeply philosophical at its best subgenre, but it's also fucking cool at the same time. And so one of the things I love about good speculative fiction is the type that can pull you into a story and make you care about character and immerse you in a world, and then afterwards it's tricked you. It's also made you think. And so you might put the book down, or you might have watched the movie a day before or a week before, and you're still thinking about it, and these ideas are still resonating. That's the best in art, I think, and the best in spec fic can do that. Um, and I think the best cyberpunk can certainly do that. So I think, and so partly it's that drew me to it. Partly I think more and more because I lived in Southeast Asia for a decade. Cyberpunk's a very East meets West type subgenre where East and West that fusion is is an inherent part of the aesthetic. Obviously, that I my work, not obviously for your listeners, but for your listeners, um, my debut, which you mentioned, is set in Vietnam. My most recent novel that came out is set in Macau, and I have a novella in between those two, which is set in Australia. So the Asian influence is very important to me as well. And it also suits it because I think one of the world building premises of my work is that America has collapsed and China is the sole superpower. Yeah. So we're heading into the so-called Chinese century. So what will that look like? But that is also suited to cyberpunk. So I think the genre it contains so much of what I find um, fascinating politically and philosophically, but also in forms of as a form of storytelling as well.
I just wanted to ask in relation to what you said about almost it tricking you. It's deep and philosophical and asks the unanswerable questions, but it's also fucking cool. A big tension I have found reading a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, anything that sort of verges on that kind of action genre is the balance of fight scenes that are really cinematic and cool without kind of detracting from the realism of the character and the underlying world and the journey. And one thing I loved about 36 Streets was you had these amazing frenetic fight scenes where Lin is on the brink of being defeated or does get beaten multiple times. But I never felt like you were veering into what I would call Marvel territory where things just kind of, where you lost the immersion. Was that something you worked specifically on? Did that take a lot of thought to balance that kind of cool cyberpunk tech infused combat with that really grounded character stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like with all things creative, some things are conscious and some things are you do unconsciously or subconsciously. I think with violence, I hate violence to be empty and action to be empty. And what we see in your example in the Marvel universe, and I think Star Wars is another example of empty violence. So uh, sometimes people complain that not many, um, but you tend to focus on your critics. But every now and again, someone will say, "Oh, this book is too violent." And what bothers me is it's actually way less violent than a Star Wars movie. Because in a Star Wars movie, they kill fucking billions of people. But it's empty and distant and abstract. A planet blows up. Oh, we got to up that. Let's blow up 3 planets in the next one. What's his name? Anakin in The Phantom Menace blows up a ship that has like 10,000 people on it. And he goes, woohoo! And then there's a quip with fucking R2D2 or whatever. Um, that's ultra violent and empty. Whereas I might have, a scene where someone gets beaten up or someone dies. The violence hits hard for the reader, but it also hits hard for character. So, I mean, but so I like it. I think it's important if you're going to have violence to have the consequences of it and the trauma of it for the perpetrator and for the victim. And that's violence at the individual level, but violence in a cultural level too. So so in 36 Streets we have the cycle of imperial ambition in Vietnam, and we have the collective trauma of warfare and so forth. And then there's the individual Lynn in 36 Streets, who's quite a traumatized individual, and she's dealing with it through drug use and through trying to, in a way, emotionally seal herself off from the world. So the answer is yes. I think it's super important to have, if you're going to have violence and action in your books. Well, I mean, you can have, look, don't get me wrong, we all like some good entertainment, but for me, and I complain about, well, Star Wars isn't very good anymore, but some of the old Star Wars films are pretty good. Marvel can be okay. So I like entertainment as much as the next person, but for my work and for the work I really love, it's got to have a purpose, the action and the violence. It's got to have meaning, and it's got to have consequences. And yeah, absolutely. I'm not just filling space. I'm like, I've got 5,000 words. Let's have an extended fight scene. No, it's all vitally important to character development and the narrative, and thematically, perhaps most important of all, it's important thematically.
I think that's a really good point that you've raised there about violence being kind of the thematically important as well as important to entertainment and the general flow of the plot. Lynn as a character is kind of an interesting one because there's an element of moral ambiguity, and I think we see this. This is one of those hallmarks of cyberpunk is you've got the protagonist who has the morally grey or morally ambiguous protagonist. How did you find it in that you sort of also have to make the audience identify with this character and you have to kind of build that level of pathos that you would otherwise? Did you find that challenging, or what sort of considerations did you bring in as you were writing Lynn?
Yeah, it's a good question. I love a morally ambiguous character, and I love Lynn. But again, she's a hard person to love. So this is it's an interesting question, because this is where um, my judgment on what the reader needs is usually very sharp. But my judgment on this particular one is not in the mainstream. So I know that even if I love a character and find them, I'm just going to turn my light on here, sorry, and find them sympathetic. I listen very carefully to first readers, because sometimes I'll say, this person isn't so sympathetic. I can't really identify with them, blah blah blah. Now, in a way, I don't need to have someone who's relatable and nice and friendly and all that bullshit. But I do need someone you can care about. And so Lynn is a deeply, deeply flawed character who's who's very alienated from the people around her, a deeply traumatized person, and she's navigating a brutal, violent and brutal world in the gangster world. How do you make her morally ambiguous yet in some way, I don't know if necessarily sympathetic as a character, but a character that you can care about their fate? It's a tough question, and this is a question of craft, and a question of, um, in terms of your in terms of a bit as a writer, is something that I've had to work very, very hard on. And so she was even less sympathetic in the first couple of drafts, but I brought some things in just around her family and around her family in particular, so the reader could identify with her a little bit more, or understand her a little bit more. So it's a tough question for me to answer, because I find in not my own work, but in other works as well, characters sympathetic and I really like them, and other people will say, "Oh, I hate that character." So this is where I have to be self-aware enough to know that I need to put a little bit more in than I would normally like to, because my normal approach, like mentally, is just I'm not holding your hand, dickhead. Just I've put the clues in. I've put the sympathetic touches in. Just fucking go with it, moron. However, that's not the right approach. You've got to think not about an audience as such, like what will the audience think and will they be offended? No, but you've got to think about the reading experience. And so I always think about the reading experience. And character, I do a lot of work. Characters are really centrally important to all of my works, and story flows from character. So you better get it bloody right. So character is something, and being that sympathetic is something that I work on a lot. However, sorry, this is a very long meandering answer because it's a tough question, but the I can't coddle the audience either. This is still cyberpunk. This is a dystopic universe, and the people who exist in it are products of their environment. So you've got to have that balance. You can't have something that's twee and earnest because it just doesn't. It's from a world building perspective, it's unrealistic, and from a storytelling perspective, it makes no sense. So you've got to find that balance. Again, I love the characters that Lynn in 36 Streets and Endel in The Escherman and Jack in Ghost of the Neon God. I love all those characters, but they're flawed and complex. And so I think, okay, and one more addendum. This is a really long answer. We're all flawed. The readers are all flawed. The readers have a dark side. The readers are hopefully complex. And so it also makes them more deeply human in a way. So I want not necessarily sympathetic characters, but deeply human characters. There, I got to my answer. It took me about 5 minutes, but that's what I want to end on.
I wanted to ask, or rather comment on and then ask about, a section in the center of 36 Streets, which completely blew me away as I was reading it, but also really disjointed my expectations based on, I think, assumptions I had made about the genre. That's the Fat Victory section, where you change your perspective, you change the style. The voice is it's there's still Lynn in there, but it also feels very fresh and very different. Um, I expected reading that there would be some almost like mechanical plot aspect to what was in Fat Victory. Like I was saying to Arden a couple of days ago, I almost expected for Lynn to have to go back into Fat Victory in the climax of the story to find some key detail about the grand conspiracy. And when that didn't happen, it framed that section as it's not a plot thing. It was purely, at least to me, and you can tell me if my interpretation is wrong, it felt very much like it's an emotional and a thematic experience for both Lynn and the reader. It really kind of it brought into clarity a lot of the world and the context of the setting. But did was that feels like a big gamble, because I feel like if you hadn't done it as well as you did, many readers could walk away going, why was there that section in the middle where everything stopped and she was in VR for 50 pages or whatever? So what prompted you to do that, and were there periods when you were doubting if that was a good idea, and did you have to change it a lot to make it fit?
Yeah, good question. I think it does. No spoilers, but it is relevant to the plot, I think. But, uh, however, yeah, true. Not. It's also very thematically important, as you say. So, but that's interesting that you thought you might have to go back into the game, huh? So, it's a good question because that's the section of the book that I had the most doubt about. I was most worried about because, from the reading perspective, I'm reading a cyberpunk novel. Let me go into the science fiction world. And then fairly early in it, there's a long extended section in the Vietnam War, um, where, as you say, it goes from third person to first person and it goes from female to male. But it is Lynn in there as well. I thought that was a huge risk, and I worked very, very hard on the Fat Victory section, because I felt like I had to absolutely nail it, because I was fearful that the reader would be halfway through and just put the book down. Like, I didn't sign up for fucking the Vietnam War, man. Put it to one side. But thematically, it's important because of the idea of violence and collective violence and psychological warfare and colonialism and the cycle of history and all these sort of things are all come together in that section of the book. So, no, it was the toughest part to write, and it was the riskiest. I felt the riskiest part, and it's ended up being the most successful because it's the one that people talk about the most in reviews in a good way. To the point where I think I was interviewed a couple of months ago, and the interviewer said that they felt slightly traumatized at the end of the section. And I said, good, because that was the purpose of the game. And that's what happened to Lynn. Um, so, yeah, I think, but this is also what good science fiction does too. It kind of, it exposes you to the unexpected. It can take you on a trip. Cyberpunk has so much that it can do that's mind blowing in terms of simulation and VR, and these, memory editing or whatever it might be. So do it. Use all the tools at your disposal. But yeah, because this, uh, as you point out, and as I was saying, like I kind of change genres in a way. It becomes a war novel for 50 pages, a Vietnam War novel 50 pages. And unless you really nail it, the reader's going to put the book away. It didn't happen. It was successful, but yeah, creatively, it was the riskiest thing. Absolutely, I think.
I think that you're definitely right. I like that you just said that the cyberpunk has a lot of tools available, right? It's a science fiction subgenre. You can go anywhere with it, and that can be both liberating, but also kind of confusing if you don't have any pillar upon which you can kind of use to guide you. You did touch on memory, and I think that's something that we should definitely focus on. Um, you know, in spoiler free, but in the Escher Man, you have the omissioners, and that also ties into the Candel U device in Flame Trees, your short fiction. You've kind of got this um, unifying theme of memory editing and how that impacts people's identities. Um, the Escher Man, so from my understanding, that was actually the first novel that you wrote, and then you put it away, worked on 36 Streets, and then came back to it. Is that right?
Yeah, it was a long it was a long and I've just written an article actually. I haven't published it yet, but I'll publish it either today or tomorrow about 3 different ways to write a book. Um, One's the fix up, and Ghost of the Neon God was a fix up novella. And then I wrote the Aliens tie-in 5 months, but then the Ishman was an odyssey because it took 10 years. So I wrote the book, and it was my kind of the third novel I wrote. The first two were trunked, and I got an agent, and he couldn't sell it. And at first he loved it, the Escher Man, and then after he couldn't sell it, he said it was an English guy, posh English guy. He said, he said, actually, it's not a very good book anyway. what a He's such a piece of shit. And I ended up dumping that guy. But so that was trunked. But Lynn is a important minor character in the Escher Man. And I couldn't get her out of my head. So I'm like, fuck, man, I'm going to write her origin story. So I wrote 36 Streets, and that took about 5 years. And in those 5 years, the Escher Man was just sitting there, and I didn't touch it, but I maybe in 5 years wrote 5 notes on the cover of it, just things that my creative brain demanded that I add, even though it was trunked. Anyway, 36 Streets was written. It came out. I mean, it had its own checkered path to publishing, but finally was published and did well critically, and then won the Australis. And then I went back to the Escher Man and thought to myself, I just wondered if it was a good book, and if it was how much I'd improved. I suppose when I don't know if you ever look back on your old stuff and think, man, I was shit back then. And so I expected that. I expected to go back and go, I wonder how shit I was when I was writing this. And I read it and I was like, this book's fucking cool, man. but my craft wasn't up to it because. So have you finished Arden? Have you finished the Escher Man?
I have. Yes. Yep.
Okay. So
and I will say,
from a technical
to
perspective,
say that it makes sense that it took a long time to write.
yeah. Well, for just the technical perspective, it's an unreliable narrator who's been having his memory constantly wiped and having false memories implanted, and it's first-person perspective, and it has to be completely explicable to the reader the entire time. Yeah, that's so fucking hard from a technical perspective. So I think it took me 10 years just to be good enough to write it in a way. So I did a huge edit. I went back, did a massive edit on it. Probably had rewriting on every single page. Added, probably deleted. Did that before we started the podcast. I mentioned to you that how satisfying it is to have something, say it's 75,000 words, and you delete 5,000 words, but you add 5,000 words, and it's the same length, but it's so much better. It's like that with the Escher Man, where I probably deleted 10,000 words. I think I deleted 5,000 and added 10, something like this. Anyway, it was a lot better novel, and then I had to send it to my new agent, and then he sold it to the same publisher that published, to Titan Books, who published 36 Streets. So, in a way, it was the third book I wrote, but also the fifth book I wrote, if that makes sense. And it just, well, I don't know if there's any lessons here other than dogged persistence pays off sometimes.
I think that's a very valuable lesson for any creative to learn. I think that there is, as with any sort of art, there's a point where if you want it to go beyond a hobby, you kind of have to be willing to grit and bear it, and that's definitely been the case with your writing here. I can see. I think the Escher Man, as coming to it from a reader's perspective, who having read 36 Streets and going into the Escher Man, I love that it is sort of the continuity of the world is one of the things that I really enjoy. I think that there is a great there's something very refreshing about seeing Australians portrayed in the relatively near future in this kind of Southeast Asian context. Especially as someone who I've lived and worked in China, and you've obviously lived and worked in Southeast Asia. It did feel very real. It did feel very. I guess there's an element of real research to the whole process. Something which sort of really stuck out to me was the Australianisms you use in the book, particularly in the way that you name characters. So, like, you've got Wangaratta early on, you've got the Axe. I like the idea of sort of giving guys nicknames entirely based on their one character trait, which is such an Australianism in and of itself, and is also very refreshing to see on a mainstream science fiction novel. Do you find that this is something you're intentionally leaning into, or is it just a natural way that you end up writing?
It's kind of both. It's my instinct, but I do lean into it. When I started writing, I mean, these conversations are ongoing, but I still remember when I started writing. Say it was 12 years ago when I started. So I started in my 30s, so a bit later than most of my peers. But one of the conversations at the time was, how accessible should your work be to Americans? Because you want to, it's the biggest market, and you want that your work to be accessible. Well, the theory was you want your work to be accessible to that market. So people were saying, some people said they set their work in America. Some people said that they would have an American character. Some people said that they would tone down slang. and cultural dimensions for Australia, but for other cultures. And I thought, fuck that, man. I mean, like, why write? Why write if you're going to just start off compromising yourself that heavily? So I just leaned into the things that I really care about and know about and want to write about. So I leaned into. I was started my writing career when I really made that decision. Oh, I really want to take this seriously. I was living in Vietnam. You cannot not write about that culture if you're living in it. It's so vivid, so overwhelming, so vibrant. It's got such a dark and tragic history. Like it's just so that had to be part of my work. And I'm not going to ignore my culture either. And I'm not going to efface Australian characters because of I care about because I'm thinking about how stupid someone in America may be. Like here's the thing, people that whole even though it's true I've probably limited my audience, that whole line of thinking focuses on your worst reader. The whole line of thinking is what's the worst American reader I can have? Oh, they're ignorant, they'll be fearful of new things, they won't understand it, they'll put the book away. You don't think about that. You think about your best reader. If you have to think about a reader, think about your best reader. And the best American reader is the same as every other reader, which is if you, the best science fiction reader is someone who wants to have their mind blown. They want to be exposed to new ideas and new cultures. They want to experience something different. They want to be immersed in a new world and they want to be taken on a journey. That's true of Americans is the same as true of anyone else. So I think about them as a reader, and don't make any concessions on language or culture because they'll figure it out. Because your best reader is also smart and they'll figure it out in context. We can do it. We can read a book from another culture and figure out from context. It's kind of ridiculous to think an American can't. Your best reader can. The best American reader can. So now, to be clear, it's probably limited my audience a bit. That's true. However, I know I can see my royalties, so I know where my audience share comes from. And 40% of my readership is American, and that's the biggest. Then it's like 35% UK, and then 20% Australian, and then 5% the rest of the world, roughly. So you will find good work will find an audience. Now it's true. If I was writing an epic fantasy, I'd have a bigger audience. If I was writing space opera, which kind of a bland Star Trek-esque cultural setting, I'd find a bigger audience. But it wouldn't be my books wouldn't be as good. So yeah, I don't make any concessions to some imagined idiot reader. I just write the best work I possibly can. Don't get me wrong, I don't try and be obscure. I don't try and make it confusing. I try to make it as clear as possible. But smart readers will figure these things out. And smart readers and good readers want to be there for that new experience, I think.
There's an absolutely fulfilling moment when I think, as an Australian who's grown up reading a bunch of books set in America and the UK, picking up a book that is set in Australia and does have words that I recognize and phrases that mean a specific thing. And it doesn't get old still. Like every time I pick up a book that has those Australian isms in them, I just get this little sort of uncontrollable grin because I go, yeah, no, I know what that means. I don't have to figure it out. I don't have to like pretend I know the meaning of Times Square or pretend I'm impacted by the Twin Towers falling. Like these are things that there are cultural touchstones that actually resonate with me. The scene in 36 Streets where Lynn and her sister are walking along the beach and they meet the boys. And just like that was like I've been there. Like I've met people on the beach, like just at me and my little brothers walking along and you meet other kids and there's that tension and there were just these it was all the little things and the way you wrote Kylie as this sort of fish out of water Australian woman. Did I get her name right? Kylie? That's yeah, cool. I'm horrible with names. And like even just like the way she was written was so vivid. I was like, that's just my mum. That's so strange. Do you think, because you talk about in your wider work, because obviously it's interconnected, um, this idea of China being the only remaining superpower, does that must give you a lot of freedom, I imagine. Do you sort of revel in that un-Americanized future? Is that something you're thinking about a lot, or is it just because of your um past, like living in Southeast Asia and your work? Is it just what's familiar?
I don't think I revel in a non-American future. I think I fear it, if I'm be perfectly honest. I mean, I've been in my past and in my present, I've been and a huge critic of American foreign policy. As anyone, as I used to be a diplomat, and international relations is my background. Anyone with that background probably should be a fierce critic of American foreign policy. However, I've also lived, like I said, I also lived in Southeast Asia, different parts of for a decade, and so I understand it, what the future will look like from their perspective, and especially a Chinese-dominated future. It's worse. So imagining a world where America has collapsed and China is the sole superpower is not. Um, I don't do it to revel in a lack of Americans. I do it because it's plausible, and that what if is an interesting backdrop, I think, to build a world in. Um, so I didn't even intend this. This is, like I said before, like when you write, you did things consciously and unconsciously, and so one of the thematic issues, I guess, which is unconscious, was the is it unconscious or subconsciously? What's the correct term there? Unconscious is you're lying on the ground, and subconscious is the part of your brain. Okay, so probably subconsciously. Um, I think I've been using that interchangeably. Is that well, sorry, one of the reviewers said that it was a post-Western future. Now, I didn't mean to do that, but it kind of is. But that's my experience as an Australian living here and my Australian living in the region. I can imagine a future where actually America doesn't matter anymore because you see the seeds of it in our present. You see the seeds of how China would act already in Taiwan and what it's trying to do in it with its neighbors, with its South China Sea. You can see the seeds of it in kind of the um, in how elements of the business community and some politicians are so obsequious to a totalitarian dictatorship. So you see the seeds of it in the now. It's an ugly thing. Um, and like I said, I'm not a fan of American foreign policy, but it's like that saying. What's the saying? Democracy is the worst type of government, but it's better than all the rest. I think Winston Churchill said that, or something like this. Like America is the worst superpower, but it's better than all the rest. Like, so, um, although actually the best superpower is the balance of superpowers. If we're getting really into wonky international relations, it's good to have a good balance of power. But no, I don't revel in America going absent. I think it would be a very bad thing internationally and for the international order, and which is so I try not to get involved in American politics too much anymore. I try not to engage in any debates and let it absorb too much of my time. But I am kind of fearful of, if Trump winning, what that will do in terms of the international order, and a rules-based order, and empowering dictatorships, and seeing the further decline of democracy. So this is something that in a way feeds into the vision that I've put forward in my novels. Yeah. Sorry, that was a bit meandering again. I apologize.
No, that was excellent. I thought that was a really poignant answer. Especially, I think you hit the nail on the head. Or that reviewer who called it post-Western is completely on like right on the money. I think a lot of your work does have an element of the collapsing hegemony and what that sort of means for the everyman. I think that's kind of what makes it so accessible. You haven't gone this whole pseudo space opera route of here's the grand political machinations. It's instead here's how, Joe Blow down the road lives in this new world order. I think that's what drew me into your narratives in the first place. And I like that. Just going back to that Australianisms in your work, the again spoiler free, but the AC/DC inclusion in the Escherman was a personal highlight of mine. As someone who was brought up on AC/DC, that was a great little a nod to the Australian experience. There was also, and I hope that this is intentional. If not, I'm reading far too much into it. One of the characters in the Escherman does mention wanting to do someone else slowly. And all I can think of is this a Keating reference? Is this was that intentional?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. Okay, great. Because I thought there's a small, there's a minority of readers that are going to absolutely love this, and I figured that's great.
There might be 12 ever who read the book who get the reference.
Yeah. That's it. We'll start a fan club. Yeah. No, that was good. Onto your short fiction for just a second. So you've predominantly written a lot of cyberpunk short fiction. You have, however, also done forays into other genres. So I know that I think it was earlier this year or maybe late last year you had a piece in Grimdark magazine, the Marked Man. How did you find approaching broad question here, but how do you find approaching sort of a fantasy genre coming out of cyberpunk? Was there anything that you sort of wanted to do significantly differently in that genre, or was it kind of an element of trying to capture the same vibe that you had in cyberpunk and transplanting it across?
I am. I said before that I said if I wanted a bigger audience, I'd write a fantasy novel. Well, as it happens, I am writing a fantasy novel at the moment, but not for that reason. In my own defense, I I got a bit burnt out actually on cyberpunk about 4 years ago, and it was during the pandemic. We were all stuck. I was meant to be living in Bangkok, but it got cancelled because of COVID. And so instead of being in Bangkok for 3 years, my partner had some work there. I was here stuck in Australia, stuck in my house most of the time. And I'm heavily influenced by setting, like most people, but I suspect I'm more influenced by most by setting and in my work. So I ended up just happened to be reading a lot of a couple of books about uh, the convict era, and then got the germ of an idea from that, uh, and also the germ of an idea from I was reading that the Australian population in about 1800, in the right when the start of the convict era, with the exception of a couple of Pacific nations, the Australians were the most tattooed people on earth because of all the convicts and all the rest. They'd basically be illiterate and telling their stories through tattoos on their bodies. So I got the idea for a tattoo magic system. But then, of course, because of my experience in Southeast Asia, I wanted to fuse in some Korean and Japanese elements as well. So I started writing a fantasy novel. What's different and what's the same? One of the things about cyberpunk is it's a noir subgenre. It's tech noir essentially, and noir is not always, but in my view, is best when it is telling a story as efficiently as possible in a way, where you're really trying to have this almost using language that is layered in a way that implies a lot more, but which is quite sparse, where you're not going on to long digressions, where you kind of hammering people with some dialogue and and you're nailing your descriptions. And in a way, it's a lot of the lessons you learn from writing short stories translates well to writing noir, a kind of hard boiled style. and cyberpunk is a kind of hardboiled science fiction. Fantasy is kind of the opposite. You can sit back a little, and you can take some more time with descriptions, and you can have more characters, and you can do all of these types of things. I'm not saying, and how can I put this? I'm not saying you're losing anything with cyberpunk, but with cyberpunk, you really have to make every sentence count and every word count. Whereas fantasy, you're allowed to be a bit more expansive. So that would be one difference. I still like the idea though of packing a lot into every scene, and by the same token, I still like the idea of using all those lessons you learn from short stories. I still like that discipline, but it feels liberating in a way, in some ways, to be writing this fantasy novel, and it could be 200,000 words, and so fucking what, you know. I'm going to go for it. So it is a very different form of writing. Not very different. It's different in some ways, but there's certain skill sets, even from short stories, that are still important that you bring over to writing a fantasy novel. But my experience so far, I haven't finished yet. I wrote that one short story that you saw in Grimdark magazine, but that's in the same world. In fact, that's part of the novel. And so I'm finishing a novel now, but then I've been writing this fantasy novel for 4 years but I've written two other science fiction novels during that period. I should stop getting distracted, but I'm going to finish it. So it'll take another couple of years to finish the fantasy novel. And whether it's successful is another question entirely. Whether I'm suited to writing in this form is another question entirely. It kind of sucks that I have to find out the hard way. It's going to take me 5 or 6 years to figure out whether it's a success or not. But I'm reveling in the world. What was that? Sorry.
So that's the joy of the craft, you know. You've got to just you stick to it for 5 or 6 years, and then you pray.
Oh, exactly. It's liberating and terrifying to be on the edge of this creative abyss, because it's just you. No one else is responsible but you, and you can do anything. And God, that's exciting. But holy shit, you could waste 3 years of your life easily. Which is one of the reasons short stories are again. I know that doesn't suit everyone, but short stories are good because you can try out ideas, and that failure can be a failure of a month instead of a failure of 3 years. And so for this novel, I published that one short story, but I'll publish other short stories in that world before the book comes out, and that's testing ground in a way. Do I sell the story? How are they received? Are people getting into the world? Even more so, probably cyberpunk. I mean, world building is important in everything, and I'm kind of a world building fundamentalist. Like, I really want everything to make sense internally, and to be consistent, and to be rich, and to feel lived in. And so, in a way, it's probably harder with a fantasy novel, because not that it's easy in cyberpunk, but it's harder in a second world fantasy because you're actually building a whole new second world. So you have even probably more work to do in a way. So I'm spending an enormous amount of time building that world. Around me on my walls, around where I'm doing this interview, is I have characters, flora, fauna, the tattoo magic system, geography, climate, armor, language. Like, it's all spread out, so I have this constant reference point. I could probably even show you. Can I take my camera off and just show you briefly? So there, well, this is that's characters and their tattoos. I don't think my cord is long enough, but over there is some stuff, and then over where is it? I can't get it. Anyway, it's everywhere. I surround myself with the world. Oh, and by the way, there's a science fiction novel here. That there is that's a science fiction novel. Yeah. Hopefully, I didn't reveal too much of my.
No, no, no. That's great. I think that's kind of an excellent little note for anyone, especially like obviously we in our organization have a lot of people who really aspire to write novels. The idea of kind of surrounding yourself and immersing yourself in that world is definitely valid. I think there's an element of keeping your own internal consistency and continuity. I mean, a lot is often made of Tolkien constructing his languages and then making a novel to fit the languages kind of thing, that the world building first, the novel second. But it's definitely a valid approach, and also it's just really fucking cool. That always helps.
I mean, I have to say, I do. There is a danger. The only danger in the Tolkien approach is that you get world building disease, and you never stop world building, and you never write a story. So this is why I kind of forced myself to write short stories, because short stories are a way of testing out your world and building it brick by brick, but also seeing if character and story works within it. And it's also a way of forcing yourself to because the process of writing a short story or a novel, it's iterative. You also build the world at the same time. So I do immerse myself, but I think it's very important. For me, it's very important to actually get some work out there as well. Otherwise, because I run world building workshops um, at festivals and at uni and at sometimes at high schools, and talk about it in cons. And I meet a lot of people who have world building disease, and they're so absorbed in it they've never written in the building the world. They've never actually written a story in it. So it's a trap. It's a creative trap where people um, can't get out.
On the topic of novels, and just before we wrap up, because we are approaching sort of the end of our session, um, a bunch of us in the organization in Meridian Australis have been doing our best to peer pressure Arden into finally writing a novel, because we believe he definitely has the skill set and the vision, but he's just keeping himself in the short story box. Would you care to add to the peer pressure at all?
Well, what? Yeah, sure, okay. Look, I mean, my path was what you could consider Arden. How many short stories have you written or published, I should say?
Published. I have 8 out now.
Okay, so you could consider one of the old school routes to getting a novel published is you have a collection out first, and then you move on to the novel. So that's what I did. I had maybe 20 or so short stories, and I chose the 12 best, and I did the collection, which is here, Neon Leviathan. And then what that does is it gives you some, if it's good, some creative kudos. You don't get a very big audience. It's the audience for short fiction is tiny, but industry people industry people know about it and will have heard about it, especially if you get a couple of good blurbs on it, and maybe you get nominated for a couple of awards. So within the industry, it still matters. This is a, how can I say, almost an instrumental way to get to a novel in terms of forging a path where the publication of your first novel is easier. It's still bloody hard, but if you establish yourself with a collection, then the next step can be a novel, and that's an easier path to forge. However, whether you start one now or not it kind of depends on your creative urge. If you're feeling like writing a novel, you maybe should go for it. Or if a short story expands into that, maybe you should go for it. The book that I'm just editing now, for example, was meant to be a short story that I wrote in January because I wanted to finish the fucking fantasy book. But that short story was kind of a cool idea. It became a novel, which I've just finishing the edits on, but it's still going to take another year or so. So it also depends on whether a short story idea is powerful enough to warrant a full-fledged novel. What your pain threshold is. Novels are fucking hard. And whether you should, if you've got but I would say if you have got that hunger for short stories still, just keep writing them and then maybe put a collection together. You've done your Meridian anthology, so you have that experience of publishing. So you've got that you kind of you have that foot in the door in a way, and then the next step for you, if you keep getting published, is the collection, I would have thought, and then you're building the blocks of a career. Because you guys are how old are you guys? You guys are young, right? So you got plenty of time.
Yeah, the ravages of time are coming for us, but we're staving them off. No, I think that's a very
They're coming for you, Arden. For me, I'm fine.
yeah, that's true. 30 is approaching, and then it's all over for me. That's all right. But
Shut the fuck up. I didn't start writing until I was like 32, 33. That's when I first started writing a short story. So be quiet.
there we go. Okay, well that's affirming. I think that's a really good place to kind of to start wrapping up. Actually, do you have any other big questions, Harvey, before we?
Only one very selfish question, Tim. That novel that you're editing at the moment. Do you have a working title you'd like to share with us to sort of get us hyped?
Yeah, I got a working title. Tokyo Kill! !
Fuck yeah. Cool. Nice. Okay, so everybody,
It's everything.
please go and buy. It's everything. Everybody, please go and buy the Escher Man. Also 36 Streets and the Neon Leviathan collection and Ghost of the Neon God. Maybe just buy 10 copies of each. I don't
Do
know how
that.
Tim's doing for royalties. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. It was lovely conversation. Really appreciate it. As always, guys, you can check out the other Meridian Australis Roundtable episodes on our website or on Spotify. If you're an Australian speculative fiction author who's interested in getting involved with us, then you can find that on our website as well. We do writing groups, we run workshops, we have recently published our short story collection called Austral, which is really exciting. Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Arden, and we'll see you next time.